slide means quite a lot to me. It was actually an illustration done by my daughter over recent months during the pandemic, and I thought it was quite symbolic of one of the main reasons why I chose to get involved in this project. So my talk today is about a piece of research that we published quite recently in the journal Social Media and Society. It's called Online Social Endorsement and Covid-19 Vaccine Hesitancy in the UK. There's a long list of co-authors on this project. If you want more detail, do please take a look at the paper itself. So cast your minds back to around about this time last year, a bit earlier in the year, March 24, 2020. The sense of crisis was obviously incredibly palpable in a way that certainly I've never experienced in my lifetime, and I doubt many other people have too. But of course, the uncertainty was partly bound up with the potential response to this issue, which is the nature of the medical interventions that might get us out of the pandemic. And of course, all of that revolved around the vaccines. So at the same time, we had a great deal of misinformation about the origins of coronavirus that were around at the time. And there were, you know, those of us who were interested in misinformation were paying a great deal of attention to this and looking at it almost with horror, I have to say, at the time, because the misinformation also was about the potential vaccines as well. This is probably the most high-profile example of misinformation during the vaccine trials themselves, when we had one of the early participants in the Oxford vaccine trial, Elisa Granato, was the victim of a hoax online saying that she died as a result of her participation in the vaccine trial. It wasn't, of course, true at all. It was completely fabricated. So our sort of sense of, well, what to do about the potential problem of attitudes to the vaccines crystallized round about the springtime of 2020, May, June, and it led to a rather remarkable project that is led by Daniel Freeman at Oxford. And these are the participants in that project. It's called the Oceans Project. And this is one of our research outputs from this particular group work that we got involved in. And I'd like to thank Daniel, but also, of course, most importantly, the Oxford Biomedical Research Centre at the University of Oxford, who funded this research. So if we think back to May 2020 and that moment during the pandemic when there was such great uncertainty, one thing we do know is that there were fairly high levels of vaccine conspiracy beliefs among the UK public. So this is a survey that we carried out in the first part of the project, Oceans 1, in May 2020, looking at conspiracy beliefs. And I'm not going to dwell on this in too much detail, but if you look to the right-hand side of the slide, the red text in particular, you can see that there were quite startlingly high levels of conspiracy beliefs when it comes to vaccines. And even the neutral category is troubling, I would argue. And if we fast forward to October 2020, when we did the survey research on which this particular study is based, which addressed vaccine hesitancy specifically, we can still see quite startlingly high levels of vaccine hesitancy about a COVID-19 vaccine among the British public. So if we look at this, again, the red text is where you need to get worried. The amber text, get it when I have time, 23%. Get it as soon as possible. Only 50% of the British public thought that in October 2020. Now, in that same piece of research that was published in December 2020, based on that survey, we found that these were the attitudinal origins of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. I'm not going to dwell on these in too much detail, except to say that vaccine hesitancy toward COVID-19 is incredibly complicated. It's not quite the same as previous forms of vaccine hesitancy, for instance, related to autism, because it's bound up with multiple different complicated and complex social and political attitudes. It's not just about attitudes to the vaccination program, the speed of development of the vaccines. It's also tied in with conspiracy beliefs, attitudes to do with negative views of vaccine developers and doctors and NHS experiences. And if you have trust in the vaccines and you're confident about taking a vaccine, if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that those kinds of attitudinal roots of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy stack up on that side and make it more likely that you will take the vaccine. But from our point of view as media and communication researchers looking at this from that perspective, it's these things that really matter. It's beliefs, attitudes, views, perceptions. It's the experiences of people, the suspicion and the concern. So where do people get their information about making their decision about the vaccine? And, you know, if they have these kinds of forms of hesitancy that derive from these complex attitudinal roots, how can we potentially address this using public communication campaigns? So in this particular piece of research, what we focused on is something that's never really been done before in relation to any vaccine hesitancy, which is online social endorsements. We had a focus on what people do with media rather than what media do to people. And that's important because if we're interested in how people endorse things online, we've got to examine their purposive behavior in trying to persuade or convince other people to behave in a certain way. Traditional top-down communication is still important, absolutely. James's presentation demonstrated that. But BBC use in the UK, for instance, although it was highly used as the main source of information on the pandemic in the early stages, its use declined throughout 2020, actually. And yet, throughout 2020, about half of the UK public used social media for getting news and information about COVID-19. So still really high levels. Two further points here is that people expect to see family, friends and acquaintances are keen to get vaccinated. We respond, and decades of communication and psychology research shows this, we respond to others' experiences, to so-called social proof cues. In other words, what other people are doing, we look for proof of the wisdom of our course of action by comparing it with what other people are doing, and what are known as availability cascades. And an availability cascade is a mechanism by which, particularly online, information about the behavior of others leads to more and more people gradually adopting that form of behavior. And it's really the mechanism that underlies virality and going viral, as we often hear that phrase. And finally, people need to feel confident about encouraging others to get vaccinated. So these are the things that we had in mind. But there are some important dilemmas as well. First of all, vaccine misinformation circulates widely online. So if we're going to encourage online social endorsement, we've got to be aware of that. Secondly, media and information diets, the things we encounter in our daily lives to do with COVID-19 and the vaccines, provide us with the content that we share with others in our online networks, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. And we know that these media and information diets vary considerably, and they do play an important role in the circulation of misinformation. And a final point here is that news avoiders are very, very difficult to reach through any kind of formal campaign. So if you're avoiding the news about COVID-19 and the vaccines, where are you going to get your information from? It's very difficult to address that. So the rationale given this theoretical framework, well, there were two main rationales. First of all, that if specific media and information settings will expose the vaccine hesitant to attitudes, beliefs, information and social signals that will shape the decision to accept or avoid vaccination, we can have public health campaigns that target specific media and information settings to provide the vaccine endorsers with good material to share online, and this may also help counteract vaccine misinformation online. So this is what we did. This is our method. We ran a survey, nationally representative sample of about 5,000 adults in October 2020. We looked at attitudes and media diets for COVID-19 news and information. We undertook something known as a cluster analysis to identify the actual media diets of the British adult population, not what we think they're doing, but what they're actually doing, and the complicated blends of different media and information sources they used. Then we ran some statistical models that isolated the attitudes and the media diets that linked to the use of social media and personal messaging, that linked those things to encouraging or discouraging vaccination. And we thought of media diet as what's known statistically as a moderator. So if you have a specific media diet and you put this into the mix with all of the other variables that determine whether or not you're likely or not likely to endorse positively the vaccination online, Will that media diet act as a kind of amplifier, or will it actually act as an attenuator? So if you think about it in terms of sound, you know, somebody turns up the volume. If you have a media diet of a certain kind, will it turn up the volume on that particular form of behavior? In this case, either endorsing the vaccine or trying to persuade other people not to get vaccinated. Here's a full list of the variables in our analysis. We had all kinds of control variables. I won't dwell on these because in the interest of time, I need to move on. But we controlled, of course, for all of the classic things that we think would influence these kinds of attitudes: age, sex, income, education, you name it. But the main outcome variable was this question that we asked in the survey: how likely is it that you will use social media or text messages and personal messaging apps to encourage other people to get vaccinated? And there's the list of responses there. We included a don't know as well. And we also looked at two key attitudes that we thought were really important for explaining this, based on our findings from previous studies that we've done in our work here at Loughborough University. First of all, the news finds me attitude. This really means giving low priority to monitoring news and information and relying more on your online and social media networks of friends for information. Nobody's really previously examined it in relation to misinformation. We hypothesized that it would indicate reduced vigilance and reduced purposive information seeking. People would be less likely to seek information about the vaccines. And then secondly, far more controversially and far more troublingly, conspiracy mentality. So we have a range of different questions that assess conspiracy mentality. They've been validated in the social psychology literature for many years now. A conspiracy mentality is associated with these kinds of attitudes: a perception of low status, of having one's status threatened, a lack of control over public events, but not, interestingly, a lack of control over your personal life or interpersonal relationships, hostility to public authority. And it hasn't really been examined before in relation to online endorsement, but we again hypothesized that this would correspond with a need for control over interpersonal communication, while also fulfilling a public and political purpose. So what were the key findings? Well, we identified 6 main media diets among the UK population for getting news and information about COVID. So we had news avoiders. They use all media sources well below average. Mainstream or official news samplers. They use mainstream sources such as newspapers in print and online, television, radio, and official sources, government websites, NHS websites, slightly more than average, while their use of social media is below average. Super seekers, these are our labels by the way, use all sources far more than the average. The omnivores use all sources, but each source is used only moderately above average. The 5th group are the social media dependent, who use all social media platforms much more frequently than the average, and all mainstream and official sources less than the average. And finally, we have the TV dependent, who get their news and information about COVID-19 mainly from television and use other sources well below the average. So these are the actual blends of people's media and information diets. What we wanted to get away from was simplistic, univariable kind of explanations where we say, oh, well, it's all about social media or it's all about the BBC. We wanted to look at the complexity of people's media diets. So beyond that, we found that in basic descriptive terms, about 1/3 of the UK adult population said they intended to use social media and personal messaging apps to encourage people to get vaccinated. 1/10 said they would use social media and personal messaging to discourage others, to persuade them not to get vaccinated. Interestingly, about half were undecided either way. And finally, there was a clear and robust statistical link between vaccine hesitancy and the intention to discourage others online. The next set of findings, the final set of findings, are what we call the multivariate findings from the multivariate analysis. So what we found was that if you avoid news and you have a news finds me attitude, this is associated with the online discouragement of vaccination. On the other hand, if you are a super seeker who seeks out information from all sources, or you're an omnivore, you're most likely to be an encourager of vaccination online. And finally, and most troublingly, the combination of social media dependence and higher levels of conspiracy mentality is most likely to be associated with the online discouragement of vaccination. So what are the implications and recommendations that we made based on these findings? Well, the optimistic ones are that clearly online discouragement of vaccination is a minority pursuit. But then again, media diet really matters. The only clear link between positively encouraging vaccination in online networks is to be found between the super seeker media diet and the omnivorous media diet. The more pessimistic findings and implications are that if you avoid news, it means that you have less exposure to authoritative sources, you have fewer opportunities to learn about the vaccines, and yet at the same time, you're more likely to discourage others from getting vaccinated online. The same applies to the news finds me attitude. You score high on news finds me, you're not prioritizing information seeking, and yet you're more likely to discourage others. And perhaps most troublingly, the link between conspiracy mentality and social media use means that online discouragement is more likely to happen, and that will undermine the UK vaccination programme to some extent. So what did we finally recommend on the basis of these particular findings? First of all, direct contact. It sounds strange, somebody who's interested in online communication, but we encouraged the Department of Health and Social Care and the government to engage with campaigns aimed at the post, the workplace, local community structures, phone counselling via local health services to reach the news avoiders. TV ads, yes, but TV ads should point people away from TV and encourage visits to the NHS and other public health websites, which then in turn should feature clear and very simple ways for people to share material back into their online networks. Social media campaigns, absolutely, to provide the super seekers with the good resources to share online, but also those kinds of campaigns should encourage social media users to browse away from social media platforms and visit reliable online sources. And then finally, social media companies should intensify their removal of vaccine misinformation and anti-vax accounts. Now, I'm just going to talk you through some very, very brief examples of these things in action. So here is a story from BBC News about use of phone calls among GPs to contact the vaccine hesitant in Leicester. Here are some really good examples from the campaign that was launched just 2 weeks ago with the rollout of the TV advertising, but also embedded in that was, for instance, the Royal Mail having a postmark campaign where they would raise awareness in the direct mail to people via postmarks mentioning the vaccines, urging the public to click onto nhs.uk and targeting workplaces as well. And in online advertising, clear cues to people to browse away from the social media environment and to visit website, read about the COVID-19 vaccine. You will see that in most of the online ads, certainly on Twitter and Instagram. And then finally, well, a rather mixed picture as usual, but nevertheless, progress is being made. The social media companies, of course, have been removing vaccine misinformation since before Christmas, but recently, over the last week in the UK context, this has now been extended to removal of vaccine discouragement, not just vaccine misinformation. Thanks very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.